Good morning, Kelowna Unitarians. It is so good to be with you on this absolutely gorgeous Mother's Day Sunday. I wanted to share with you opening words from Reverend Scott Taylor, who is the lead minister of our Soul Matters program. So words from Reverend Scott Taylor. Who dreamed you into being? What stories sat in their hearts as they imagined what you would become? Who helped you see your place in the story of the world? And what matters the most? Who helped you understand that you could be the author of your own unfolding? All of which is a way of asking, who listened to you? Who listened until you could hear yourself speak? Until you trusted the voice that is your own? And what about those stories of others? Those kept in cramped spaces of silence for fear of how hard and narrow this world of ours can be. Who needs your listening ear so their story can be set free? Whose story needs held in your heart so it knows it is worth entering into the world? We say it is about listening, but really it is about love. It is through affection that our stories are born. They are wooed into this world. Never forget that, nor this. It is through loving the stories that we discover they love us back. Amen. And now I have a special surprise. We have a special surprise for everyone who is gathering with us today. There are going to be two guests in our virtual pulpit. And if you just wait one moment, I will go grab her. It is so good to be here to share you all my personal story. I, of course, am Julia. Let me tell you a bit about myself. Born in 1819, and my early life was a challenge for us. My mother died of typhoid when I was only 5, and my older brothers, Samuel and Henry, 10 and 6, respectively. And there was the little one, Louisa, a babe in arms when she left us. It was my mother's death that led to Father turning our care over to my aunt and then to Uncle Benjamin, whose liberal views suited me much more than Father's strict Calvinism, and led me to the Unitarian Church and really changed my life. Or perhaps I ought to say, allowed my life to blossom. But where are my manners? My name is Julia Ward Howe. Names are important, don't you think? They often reveal much about the person. I was given the name Julia after my sister, Julia, who died at age 3, just 2 weeks before I was born. Our childhood was hard. But the Ward name, it is well known where I live in Massachusetts. A family of wealth and circumstance. My father was a banker and always kept us in fine style. And the name Howe is from my husband, Samuel Gertie Howe, although we called him Chev, a shortened form of Chevalier. a nickname given to him when he was fighting for the Greece independence. He was very much an activist, a man of causes. When we met, he was the director of the Perkins School for the Blind. We married soon after meeting. He was attracted, he said, to my intelligence and wit. Though friends and family thought him being 20 years older, almost twice my age, meant that he was perhaps at least equally interested in other things. I must say I was surprised when marriage revealed the side of him that truly thought that a married woman, ought to be a wife and mother only. I did try to be a dutiful wife. It depressed me, and there was so much going on, new ideas, transcendentalist ideas, and oh, how I loved writing poetry and essays. I settled for children's books for a time, and my intelligence and wit, well, I never could curtail them. Chev and I actually had to separate for a time. I kept the two youngest with me when I was in Rome with my sister, and Chev had the older two girls with him in Boston. We did eventually settle into a workable relationship that did require his honoring my many engagements outside of the home. Well, I have rambled. I tend to do that, but I wanted to share my platform today with the daughter of a dear friend of mine. Oh, look, here she comes now.
Yes, my mother was Anne Marie Jarvis, and I was given my mother's name. I am Anna Jarvis.
Welcome, Anna. Your mother was a lovely and tenacious woman. She really did a lot to motivate women to social action. And though she was some 15 years my junior, she was very inspirational for me. She worked so tirelessly for those suffering, especially with regards to health and the like.
At that time, women were not allowed to have occupations. But if she had lived later in my life, she would have been considered a nurse or even a doctor. She worked hard to ensure that families would have education regarding disease and sanitation. She would find women to help where mothers had been struck with tuberculosis. And she also developed a program that would inspect cow's milk before families would consume it, which wasn't picked up by the state until much later.
Yes, it was a time when women were very limited in the work we could do outside the traditional wife and mother. I was just telling these good folks about some of the challenges that my husband Chev and me working outside the social limitations. Though he did appreciate my editing his newspaper and appreciated my perhaps most famous poem, I wrote it when the Unitarian minister James Freeman Clarke suggested that I write new words for what had become a Civil War anthem about John Brown. The South celebrating his death and the North his martyrdom. We knew John Brown. My husband actually assisted him and had to lie low in Canada for a time following the fiasco at Harper's Ferry. Anyway, I remember going to bed that night and then waking up before it was fully yet light. All of the words for all of the verses fully filling my mind. I scribbled them down on a scrap of paper, went back to sleep, and upon awaking, I could not remember what I had written at all. But there it was, a poem requiring no editing at all. I sent it to the Atlantic Monthly, and they paid me $5 for it. Now, it is my most well-known piece, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Oh, but back to your mother. I remember particularly an event very well organized. I think it was in 1868.
Oh, yes, I remember that party. I was 4 years old, and that was the first party dress I ever wore. It was yellow. But the story of that day was told often in our house as I was growing up. During the Civil War, she was very determined not to take a side. but declared neutrality and served both the Confederate and the Union soldiers. You know, in Western Virginia, where we were living, half the counties were Confederates and the other half were Union. So the war was, after the war was over, as an effort to keep the community together, my mother was asked to plan a celebration. And so she and her clubs planned the Mother's Friendship Day for soldiers on both sides of the war. There was a band and lots of dancing, and my mother always told the story. She said the event ended with both sides, the North and the South, singing Auld Lang Syne together. It was a magical evening.
Well, I do recall about hearing this event, this rather inspiring event, and the reality that I witnessed, the carnage of the soldiers, yes, but also of the widows and orphans, the collateral damage, and oh, the impact of the economy. War is expensive, and those least able to pay for it seem to have to. That witnessing, as well as the escalating tensions in Europe, the possibility of yet another war, well, your Mother's Friendship Day inspired me to call for mothers from all around the world to unite in solidarity for peace. I actually wrote a proclamation claiming this solidarity. Perhaps you would be willing to speak it with me.
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay, here we go. I'll begin. Arise, then, women of this day.
Arise, all women who have hearts, whether your baptism be that of waters or of fears.
Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies.
Our son shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience.
From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm.
The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe our dishonor, nor violence indicate possession.
As men who have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council.
Let them meet first as women to bewail and commemorate the dead.
Let them then solemnly take counsel with each other as the means whereby the great human family can live in peace.
And each bearing after her own time the sacred impress, not of Caesar, but of God.
Yes, that rally cry for peace by the mothers of the world gained a fair bit of momentum. It was first celebrated on June 2nd, 1870, and then on the same day for the next 20 years. However, it seems that interest waned the further we got from the Civil War, or closer to the next. I know my interests became more and more focused on women's issues, on the notion of universal suffrage for women, as well as for freed slaves. Well, a focus on all sorts of issues of equality, really.
Yes. I too worked on women's issues to celebrate and honor women like you and my mother. I remember a time when I could hear my mother praying, and she said, I hope and pray that someone sometime will found a memorial Mother's Day commemorating her for matchless service she renders to humanity in every field of life. She is entitled to it. And so 3 years after my mother died in 1905, I decided to make that wish come true. we held a special memorial service to honor all mothers. The ceremony was held in Grafton, West Virginia, where I grew up, but I had to stay in Philadelphia. So I sent 500 white carnations and a telegram to my speech to West Virginia. The carnations were for all who attended the ceremony. But the flower shops took advantage of that gesture. They started to sell flowers to honor mothers, and they would increase the prices because giving flowers to moms had become so popular.
You mean that now the day that was set aside to call women to action for peace, for health, for education and equality has just become a commercial venture?
Yes, the flower and candy industries have greatly benefited from the first Mother's Day. It took me 6 years from that memorial service to write letters and petition for the United States to proclaim a national holiday. I incorporated the Mother's Day International Association to encourage countries around the world to recognize the day. And then Canada, China, Mexico, and Japan all celebrate mothers on the second Sunday in May. But the commercialization of the day really angered me. The flower companies began selling carnations, white ones for mothers who had passed and red ones for mothers who were alive, which was not the purpose at all. I chose the carnation because of the fragrance. It reminded me of my mother, but also because as the carnation dies, its petals don't fall off, but curl back to the center, just like a mother loves her children from the center of her being. That love never dying.
It is so delightful talking with you, Anna Jarvis. Would that the honest meaning of Mother's Day, a day for celebration and solidarity in the name of peace and equality, were a reality. Would that this could be a day to honor mothers and the tireless work they and all those who nurture do to raise children up to be global citizens. Sadly, though, I know the original meaning of this day remains a dream, for I am sure that wars continue to be fought and women have not yet achieved equality everywhere, or perhaps is it anywhere? That songs are yet sung about the futilities of war. But let us not forget this dream. Let us sing a song of freedom. Circle round for freedom. Let us sing that.
Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace, for all of us imprisoned, circle for release, circle for the planet, circle for each soul, for the children of our children, keep the circle whole. Circle round for freedom, circle round for peace, for all of us imprisoned, circle for release, circle for the planet, circle for each soul, for the children of our children, keep the circle whole. Circle round for freedom,
And our centering words this morning come from Reverend Christina Leon Tracy. It is a story of sorts, but really it is a story about story. A story about many stories, but one in particular. Once upon a time, there was a man with a story. This wasn't any old once upon a time story, not one you could find on a bookshelf or hear around the campfire. This was his story and no one else's. This story had been carefully crafted. It began before he was born, and this story told of his loves and fears, his dreams realized and his dreams yet to come. This story was complete. It told his whole life, including those bits that still existed in his imagination. In fact, this story was so complete, and he was so happy with his story that he carried it around to make sure it was safe. It was somewhat bulky and unwieldy, but he didn't mind. It was his story. The thing about this story, however, was that it was very fragile. Made up of many pieces and held together by only his own imagination, he was worried it might break apart at any minute. And so he grew more and more protective of his story. He held it even closer, and he went about his life. As he went about his life, he checked on the story to make sure he was following it correctly. He avoided adventures and unknowns because, well, they might break his story. And then one day, the inevitable thing happened. Without warning, his story broke. It was unforeseen, and he hadn't done anything wrong at all. But there it was, lying in thousands of shattered pieces on the ground, with the sunlight glinting off the bits of the story that he had so carefully protected for all of those years. He was heartbroken. And since his story hadn't said to put the pieces back together, he was at a loss. What now? He sat down next to the pile of pieces and he cried. A while later, maybe it was minutes, perhaps it was hours, a group of people came out of a nearby building and saw him sitting on the sidewalk, surrounded by a pile of broken pieces, clearly in need of help. What happened here? A woman asked. My story, it's gone. I've worked so hard to build it, to protect it, to keep it from harm, and now it's gone. Gone. Is this your story here? A man asked. Yes, look at it. There's nothing left of it. It looks like it's here, not gone, said a child. We just have to put it back together. Put it back together? There's no way. You don't even know what it looks like to begin with. How could we put it back together if you don't even know me? The child was tenacious. Don't worry. With all of us here to help, we'll put it back together in a way that you would never even expect. You never know. It might be more beautiful than before. And so they swept up the pieces of the man's story carefully and went together into the building from which they had emerged. They poured him some hot coffee and sang a song he had never heard before. Something about coming again and again, though you've broken your vows 1,000 times. The song was soothing and the coffee was warm. He began to feel hope again that his story could be put back together. And it took a long time. Maybe it was days, perhaps it was years. but they got it all back together and they added new parts, and some old parts just didn't fit anymore, but that was okay. The child was right. It was more beautiful than before. And this time, the story was held together not only with his imagination, but the imagination and the support of an entire community. It wasn't nearly so fragile, and it even allowed for adventure. I invite you into a moment of silence as we contemplate this story of stories. This morning, we explore the story of beginnings. You were introduced, or perhaps reminded, of the story of the beginning of Mother's Day, a day that memorialized the women who sought for peace and justice from the Civil War and all wars. And I wanted to share reflections on another story of beginnings with you all today. This week, we are celebrating 60 years of being a faith. On Wednesday, May the 12th, it will be the 60th anniversary of the merging of the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America into our current Unitarian Universalist Association, the two halves of what is now our church community. And 60 years later, we find ourselves often still struggling to find a way to explain what we believe and who we are. Conversations had been happening between the two denominations for years before 1961. Both being liberal faith communities, the youth groups of the youth groups of each individual denomination joined together their resources to form an autonomous organization called the Liberal Religious Youth. 7 years before the birth of the UUA. And really, this was the snowball at the top of the mountain that started the avalanche. In fact, it was stated by Thomas Starr King, a Unitarian minister who died nearly 100 years before the merger, stated that the only reason the Unitarians and the Universalists haven't already joined is that they are too closely related to be married. Indeed, Unitarians and Universalists had such similar theological stance that there was very little keeping them apart. And as recorded in the Tapestry of Faith curriculum, Faith Like a River, in the session From Why to Why Not, an early part of this story goes, while the two denominations tentatively approached the idea of consolidation, Unitarian and Universalist religious educators continued their history of collaboration, which began in 1903 when the Unitarians and the Universalists were among the early members of the Religious Education Association. In the early 1930s, two members of the staff of the Universalist General Sunday School Society joined the Unitarian Curriculum Commission to begin a collaboration on curriculum. In 1937, the American Unitarian Association appointed Sophia Lyon-Foz as curriculum editor for a comprehensive series of curricula and supportive material. The New Beacon Series in Religious Education, it was called. Both Unitarians and Universalist congregations used this material for decades before the two denominations merged. In addition to the religious education groundwork, the emphasis on freedom being core to both traditions was significant. For Unitarians, the core idea of freedom linked back to the Edict of Torda, which was written in Transylvania in 1568, and it articulated that each person was allowed to choose their own faith, no matter what the Lord of their land declared to be true. And for Universalists, their freedom was more so linked to their idea of salvation. The idea that they were predestined for heaven or hell became the ground from which the Universalist theology grew. The idea that both denominations had a theology or a study of the divine that was grounded in this world, not the next one. Faiths that are focused on how we love and enter relationships here and now, and not a people to wait for the next life. Rather than highlighting our faith on shared beliefs, we have focused our community. We have focused our faith on practice. We practice not right belief, but we aspire to right practice in what, at our best, we understand to be a messy human process. Although there are so many similarities of our two denominations, there were distinct differences as well. Each community loved the way that they self-organized, and they had very different terms of governance. Fear was presented on both sides before the merger. The Unitarians were concerned that the Universalists would slow down their growth, and the Universalists were concerned that they would be subsumed by Unitarians and forgotten. And probably most difficult to overcome was one that we might even be still struggling with today, is the social economic status of their members. But as I consider the plans to merge, I think about the questions from our opening reading this morning. Who dreamed the UUA into being? What stories sat in their heart as they imagined what our faiths would become? Who helped imagine our story? Who helped us see the place for Unitarian Universalism in the story of the world? I am often humbled and moved by the idea that hundreds or likely thousands of 14 to 19-year-olds were the ones who initiated this dream, the ones who were ready to imagine a different story for their religious communities. Also, there are these moments of appreciation for the initiation of our merged denomination that reminds me of the centering story this morning, a place where we can bring all of our broken story bits to, and perhaps find a sense of wholeness, a sense of being gathered up, no matter how fragile or strong, no matter how perfect or not, and being able to come together again. Come, yet again, come. I also witness a synchronicity between the merging of our denomination and Mother's Day, the comfort and connection that both mothers and our faith can bring one of each of us, and the disappointment and frustration that are potential within both relationships. The love and admiration, the brokenheartedness and the displeasure. Both our relationships with our mothers and our relationship with our faith community might lack the needs that we bring forth. They might leave us wanting, or we might leave them behind. Relationships with mothers, as well as relationships with our faith, can be so complicated. And here and in there, perhaps, is the concept of it takes a village. It takes a village, or perhaps more appropriate for our time, it takes a community to raise a child. I remember the people in my life that were a regular part of my upbringing, leaders within our Scouts community, other members at the church that I grew up in, my parents' best friends who were aunties and uncles for me. So many people were involved in raising me, even though my mother spent a lot of her time being the one who got us ready for school and was home when school let out. It takes a community to raise a child, but perhaps even more so than that, it takes a community to raise a family. It takes a community to create a faith, especially a Unitarian Universalist faith community. A community that is forever shifting and changing and living into the changes that we are, of the ways we are together. A living community that is made up of dreams and visions and possibilities and ideas of those who are here together to share of themselves. Gathering together, putting our energies towards the things that we want to grow, and blossoming from our beginnings. At that first joint conference in 1961, when the Unitarians and the Universalists chose to become one faith community, they sang a hymn written some 30 years earlier for their invocation. The closing lines of that hymn go like this: "Prophetic Church, the future waits, your liberating ministry. Go forward in the power of love, proclaim the truth that makes us free. Let us make this so for our community, for our story, and for our families." Thank you.